Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Katsoris, and I'm the Publications and Events Manager at the Center for Migration Studies of New York, also known as CMS. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for a presentation on two very important CMS reports. Today, we'll start with a presentation on the report titled Undercount of Undocumented Residents in the 2020 American Community Survey, and estimates and trends in the undocumented population from 2010 to 2020 by US state and country of origin. Robert Warren, the author of the report and CMS's senior visiting fellow, will provide an overview of the findings and research methodology from this study. Next, co-authors Donald Kerwin and Robert Warren will provide background and analysis from their report, 10 years of democratizing data, privileging facts, refuting misconceptions, and examining missed opportunities. They will present top-line findings and themes from more than 30 studies done under CMS's Democratizing Data project since 2013, and examine misconceptions about US immigrant populations. Then the authors and CMS's interim director, Kevin Appleby, will discuss policy proposals to improve the US immigration system. Both reports are available on CMS's website and are published in the Journal on Migration and Human Security. We will also provide links to these reports in the chat. After their remarks, we will answer questions from the audience. So please feel free to submit your questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type in your name and question. Now, without further delay, we'll start with Robert Warren. Robert, please go ahead.
Thanks, Melissa. When I first started thinking about presenting this, I had thought about presenting trends in the population because that's kind of what I do. But I've come to realize that people are maybe more interested in the undercount estimates than the trends. So I'll just cover very quickly a couple of the more important trends between 2010 and 2020, and then I'll jump over to the undercount estimates. Melissa, can you put up the slide? That would be number 5. Okay, so what we show here is these are estimates for the top 5 states as of 2020. You might notice that Illinois has dropped out of the top 5. And you see in the total line there, you see that 1.5, the undocumented population dropped by 1.5 million between 2010 and 20. And the population from Mexico dropped even more, dropped by 2.2 million from 2010 to 2020. The one thing that probably the biggest finding here is that the undocumented population from Mexico dropped in every state except 2. So it was a large drop across the board for the whole decade. Not sure that'll continue, but we may talk about that some more later. Let's look at the next slide. So we have some interesting trends for a couple of countries here. I think, India and China have been contributing to the undocumented population and been in the news at different times. But we see that both India and China increased gradually from 2010 right up to 2016, 15, and 16. And then India had a little bit of a growth spurt there, but then started to drop. And it's a question of, will they continue to drop? And China has fallen every year since 2015. So I think those might be some interesting trends to keep an eye on. I think I'll just let you look at the report for the rest of the information about the trends and skip over to talking about how we adjusted the data for undercount. So let's start with the first slide. So I had planned to give a quick overview of how we make estimates of the undocumented population, but and maybe I will. Essentially, we use data from the American Community Survey. We pick out non-citizens who arrived after 1981, and then we take out from that, we take out people that we identify as probably being legal. such as people who get Medicare, former military personnel, government workers, excuse me, and students, temporary workers, folks like that. That gets us down to about 12 or 13 million. And then we make a further adjustment that gets us down to the number actually counted. So it's the number counted that we are talking about today. And so this graph shows data for Guatemala, and the population started off as 430 in 2010, went up to about 600,000 in 2019. And notice how smooth that line is. Those data have not been adjusted, have not been smoothed in any way. This is basically the way undocumented populations changed. The trends are fairly smooth, up or down. So anyway, the population was 600,000 in 2019. The 442,000 number there is the actual count, is our estimate of the count in the 2020 census. Clearly, hundreds of thousands of people didn't go back to Guatemala. So the way we make our estimates of undercount is essentially to extend that trend by adding to 2019. We add information about the trends in the last 3 or 4 years to come up with what we believe the number really is out there that should have been counted. So that's how sophisticated we are. We don't have a lot of statisticians like the Census Bureau or do matching big studies and things like that. We have me. So this is what we do. And the next slide gives more information about what we do. And imagine this, we have this kind of data for about 150 countries, and we analyzed the trends for all the countries. But I just want to draw your attention to the total numbers here. For 2020, 8.5 million, we believe 8.5 million were counted in the 2020 ACS, but the number really should have been about 9.5 million. So roughly a million were not counted that should have been counted. If you look at these numbers a little more carefully, you'll see that most of that undercount is for Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. About 900,000 of the million who got counted were from those 4 countries. So with that, I think I will, I'll pose 2 or 3 questions and see if I can answer them. And then after I do that, I'll turn it over, and then later I'll answer your questions. The first question I would pose is, did this large undercount, did this 1 million undercount, did it just occur for undocumented immigrants? Or was it kind of widespread among the foreign-born population? The answer is only among the undocumented. We did the same kind of analysis for the naturalized population that entered during the same time period in the same kind of detail for all of these countries. We didn't find a single country that appeared to have large undercounts. We looked at the population that came in before 1981. We didn't find a single country that had the kinds of undercounts that we see here. Clearly, it was a phenomenon that affected undocumented immigrants more than any other country, and especially Mexico and Central America. The next question you might ask is, well, was this the result of COVID-19? Is that where the problem was? And the answer is, I think, again, clearly no, because if it had been, the undercount would have been spread around to the entire foreign-born population. And we see that that was not the case. The answer, why was the undercount so large just in 2020 and only among the undocumented? The real answer is, I don't know. my guess is that it had, more than anything else, it had something to do with the Trump administration's efforts to keep undocumented immigrants out of the apportionment population. There was a lot of publicity on that, and that and maybe fear that Trump would be reelected are about the only theories that I can come up with. So with that, I think I'll just go ahead and stop here and then come back to the other part that I'll present later. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Now we'll turn it over to Donald Kerwin, who will provide an overview of the Democratizing Data Project and key findings from this report and previous ones done since 2013. So Don, please go ahead.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm going to segue to the second paper we're going to discuss today, which is, as Melissa mentioned, it's called 10 Years of Democratizing Data, Privileging Facts, Refuting Misconceptions, and Examining Missed Opportunities. We envision this paper as kind of a capstone paper on the 10th anniversary of our Democratizing Data project, which began in 2013. So I'm going to spend 4 or 5 minutes just talking about some highlights over the decade from that project. Bob has really been the intellectual author for the project from the start. Sometimes he calls himself the statistical author of it, but I think intellectual is more weighty and more fitting. And he and I have co-authored many papers under this project. The good news is that if you read this paper, you don't have to read the other 30. So go ahead and read this paper because it's I think a pretty good summary of the work that we've done. Bob has worked on this project very closely with Vicky Virgin, and at its creation in early years, he worked with an advisory group with many other researchers, academics, and think tankers. And our special thanks to the MacArthur Foundation that supported the project in its early years, and in particular to Tara Magner, who was with the MacArthur Foundation at that time, who was really a guiding light and inspiration for the project. When we created Democratizing Data, we had a few goals in mind. We wanted to make detailed demographic data available on the undocumented and other populations. And in fact, we've used the American Community Survey data to produce estimates and reports on persons who are eligible to naturalize, refugees, essential workers, potentially stateless people in the United States, the composition of the population that are in family-based visa backlogs, populations that are eligible or potentially eligible for special legal status programs like DACA, TPS, and DED, and persons who would be eligible to legalize under pending legislation. We also hoped that the project would inform U.S. policy discourse, which it has to a certain extent. Thus, for example, an early report showed that the recently undocumented were mostly overstaying non-immigrant visas rather than crossing the border. It was about 2 to 1 that were overstaying visas. So that report had very clear policy implications at the time. Obviously, a 2,000-mile wall doesn't stop overstays, and it doesn't stop most of the illegal drugs entering the country, ports of entry, or the drug proceeds and guns crossing back into Mexico and other places across the border. Another report discussed the lost family income and cost to society of a mass deportation project, what that would mean for families affected by it. Melissa, maybe we could look at the first slide of recent reports. So several reports, including this report that we're talking about today, shows how gaining legal status and advancing in status contributes to the success of immigrants and their families, and that it allows immigrants and their family members to contribute more to their communities in various ways. As a corollary, barriers to advancing in status squander human and community potential. That's what the work shows. We've also written on the conditions that make it more likely that people will progress to naturalization, in particular income, education, and English language proficiency. So really the project is about facts, but we've never thought that facts and value are at odds at CMS. And we've been quite explicit in these reports on our values and the role that immigrants, we think, play in the United States. Is we put it recently in a report on citizenship. We view immigrants as would-be citizens in a tolerant, pluralistic nation rooted in the core ideals of equality, justice, freedom, opportunity, and the rule of law. That's kind of the vision that guides the project. So facts and values. And here's this on this slide is a listing of some of the recent papers in the project. We could go to the next slide, Melissa. Finally, we make our data available in three main ways. First, through our reports, papers, and shorter briefings and profiles on particular populations. Second, through interactive, publicly accessible data tools on the undocumented and the eligible to naturalize. And third, through customized data based on requests from immigrants serving public and nonprofit organizations, particularly community-based organizations. And Evan Millett, who's the data and policy analyst for CMS, entertains and responds to those requests for customized data. And we get quite a few of them now, and we'd encourage you all, if you have particular data needs or want to know something about a particular population nationwide or in your area or whatever it might be, to be in touch with them. So that's the project in a nutshell. And I guess we'll talk about some of the particular policy recommendations in a moment, but let me hand it back to Melissa now.
Thank you, Don. Next, we'll hand the mic back over to Robert Warren, who will talk about some of the misconceptions that were analyzed in this report.
Thanks, Melissa. What I'm going to do here is tell you about 4 main misconceptions that I believe I think they're important, partly because the misconceptions have a tendency somehow to block progress in legislation. And maybe I'll elaborate on that a little bit, but I just want to cover the 4 misconceptions and give you a little bit of data about why I think they really are misconceptions. And there are 4. The first misconception is that everyone comes here, but no one ever leaves. And we have a slide for that. Melissa. Okay, so what we're showing here is that in row 1, in 2010, the ACS counted 39 million foreign-born. Okay. The next 3 lines show estimates of how many people actually arrived during the decade, or during the 9 years, really, from 2010 to 2019. So we see new arrivals of immigrants were 5.6 million. We had the non-immigrant students and workers population grew, and also about 4.5 million undocumented immigrant residents came in. So the number of people that entered actually during the 9-year period from 2010 to 2019 is about 10.9 million. So you would think that by 2019, the total foreign-born population would be around 50 million. But in fact, it's 44.7 million. The population just grew by 5.6 million, even though all of those immigrants arrived. And that's because millions and millions of people moved out of the US during that 9-year period. The first report I ever did on this was in the journal Demography. and it was on emigration from the US, and it was in 1970. Yeah, that's right, 1970. And the media haven't yet caught on to the fact that lots and lots of folks move out of the US, but the data is very solid on that. And there's more about that in our report. The second misconception I want to talk about is the next slide, please. The next misconception is that apprehensions by DHS equals growth in the undocumented population, 1-to-1 ratio. And actually the Border Patrol back in the 80s and 90s used to say that 2 or 3 moved to the US for every one they caught. And actually, if that had been true, the very last person from Mexico would have arrived in the 1990s, but it wasn't true. The Border Patrol has done reports on what percent they believe they apprehend, and it runs around 80%. I'm not sure, I've never really analyzed that report, but they believe that they apprehend about 80% of those who attempt to enter. But this chart shows apprehensions compared to population growth. For example, between 1990 and 99, there were 12.7 million apprehensions, and the population grew by about 3.4 million. Moving all the way over to the right, the 2010 to the 2019 period, there were 4.3 million apprehensions, and the population actually declined by almost 1.5 million. So the point is, there's no real correspondence between apprehensions and population growth. I'm not sure whether that might have changed over the last year or two. We're not really sure what the large increase in apprehensions portends for the growth of the population. And we probably won't know for a year or two until we get better data from the American Community Survey. But clearly, you shouldn't think that a huge increase in apprehensions means that the resident population of the US will increase all that much. So the next misconception I want to discuss is there's an idea that most undocumented immigrants arrive across the southern border. In fact, that's basically all you hear about on the news, that arrivals across the southern border. But from 2010 to 2019, 2 out of 3 undocumented immigrants that arrived as tourists or temporary visas and overstayed a visa. So and you'll see on the first row here, on the total row, the number that arrived from 2010 to 2018 was about 4 million. And 2.6 million of those overstayed visas. And about 1.3 million arrived across the border. Again, not sure how much that has changed since these numbers were compiled, but the fact that 2 out of 3 undocumented immigrants arrived by air, we had published information saying that just before the Trump administration took office. So that was information that was publicly known. Yet all of the attention went to the southern border. This is a misconception that's probably may well have cost the country dearly. The next misconception is one that was also voiced by President Trump when he proposed that we change over to a point system and do away with the family reunification system. He said that we just need to stop admitting all of these immigrants who are low skilled, and we need to get immigrants who have higher skills. Well, we did a study in which we looked at the skill level of the legal population, the legal immigrant population, which means naturalized and LPRs. And we compared that to the skill level of the native population. And by skills, I mean the codes in the American Community Survey that are for doctors, lawyers, managers, what we would mostly consider highly skilled immigrants. And it turns out that the native-born population, that 43% of the native-born population were in the skilled category, and 43% of the legal immigrants were in the skilled category. So we are getting, with legal immigration, we are getting the level of skills that are identical to the level of skills of people born in this country. And one of the interesting findings was there were particular countries that President Trump had a problem with. I won't use his term, but they were Haiti and African countries. It turns out those countries are the highest, have the highest skills of any other country. I just want to make one more quick point about this particular slide. Notice that as the class of admission, or notice as the categories go from undocumented to LPR to naturalized to native born, well, as they go from those three immigrant statuses, when you go from being undocumented to LPR to naturalized, all of these bars go up, no matter whether it's with a college degree, home ownership, or health insurance, or skilled workers. And that's the point we've been making for years now, that it's very important for people to move from one category to another, and it benefits the entire US and not just the immigrants who have come here. I think with that, I'll just turn it back to Don to talk about some legislative proposals.
Thanks, Bob. I think our capstone paper, the 10 years of democratizing data paper, it doesn't go into policy recommendations in any great depth. A lot of our other papers do, but that paper, it lifts up 3 general recommendations that are drawn from earlier papers that we've done. And the first is, as Bob mentioned, or I think maybe he didn't just mention it, but I know he's mentioned and been writing on since 1985. We've long supported a registry program and what we call a rolling registry program. And registry has been a legalization program for long-term undocumented residents since the 1920s, actually. It requires continuous residence in the US for long periods of time. It requires good moral character, not being inadmissible on security grounds, and various other criteria. So the good news about this is that there is a legalization program on the books. The bad news is that for 37 years, Congress has not advanced the entry date to qualify for this program. Thus, under the current law, you'd have to have lived in the United States for more than 50 years to be eligible for registry. And what we've recommended in past reports, and this one, is that Congress move forward that date on a rolling basis so that people in the United States for 15 years would qualify to legalize. I mean, obviously 10 years would be better, but 15 years would cover 42% of the undocumented population, because one of our findings over the course of this project is that the undocumented population have had higher percentages of long tenure in the country over the years. So 42% have been here for 15 years or more. It's 60 something for 10 years or more. Second, we recommend streamlining the naturalization process and making naturalization a public and private priority. I know that that's a priority of the Biden administration as well. We would particularly focus on people that have been in the United States for 15 years or more, which is 15% of those who are eligible to naturalize. There's a lot of groups that have very specific programs about how to increase naturalization rates. Of course, we support fee reductions, we support more generous eligibility criteria and waivers of the language and civics requirements for people that have been here for at least 15 years. Greater waivers than exist right now. Our research also shows the need to prioritize education, English language classes and proficiency, and earnings, of course, in order to increase naturalization rates. All three of those factors are associated with high naturalization rates. And third, we propose that the US recapture and reissue unused visas, which would cut in half the family-based visa backlog in just 9 years. We've extensively analyzed this backlog and the populations in the backlog, but there are around 4 million people who have been deemed eligible for a family-based visa based on a close relationship to a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident. And the fact that there's 4 million really makes a mockery of the legal immigration systems that exist. So what this proposal would do, and its versions of it are incorporated in legislation, is that it would take visas that are unused and use them to reduce the backlog, basically. So I think on the paper, the title of the paper is Missed Opportunities. And what have the missed opportunities been? I think it's pretty clear. I mean, legalization, no legalization programs, a missed opportunity. No backlog reduction is a missed opportunity. And no meaningful legal immigration reform is probably the biggest missed opportunity of them all. So let me stop there and hand it over, I think, to Kevin.
Everyone, Happy New Year to everyone. Just as we come back from our holiday season, immigration is front and center again in our national discourse. Of course, Sunday, last week, President Biden proposed a new plan on Title 42, which will affect 3 other nationalities, Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans, after he already imposed it upon Venezuelans. And of course, he was in El Paso on Sunday to visit the border and to highlight this policy and others. And then yesterday, we had a bipartisan group of senators in El Paso as well, taking a look at the border. So it's safe to assume that in the 118th Congress, immigration will again be a hot topic. Not always a positive one. I'm sure that will be used for political reasons, as we've seen over the years, and certainly from some quarters looked upon negatively. So we have to be cognizant of that. But what I wanted to talk about a bit is some of the legislation that's out there that sort of corresponds with Don and Bob's report and policy proposals that are in play, if you will, quote unquote. They're out there, they've been introduced as legislation, they have support, maybe not comprehensive support, but they're part of the dialogue. And it is more than likely that, at least in the Senate, there could be a bipartisan bill introduced to address some of these issues. Maybe not what we've seen in the past, where we have a broad legalization, but something more pared down, but would really make a difference if passed, if certain provisions were put in. So first of all, of course, all of you know of the DREAM Act. The American Dream and Promise Act was the House version last year. That will certainly be introduced. That will be in play. Last minute negotiations in Congress last year in December had that as one of the pieces and a possible framework from Senator Sinema and Tillis, which did not make it into the final appropriations bill, unfortunately. But certainly CMS has done quite a bit of study of the DACA population specifically, which is part of the Democratizing data report that Don was talking about. Some of the facts I'll just throw out: 70% of those who would benefit from the DREAM Act of 2021 have been in the country 15 years. 85% speak English well or very well. So 44% have attended some college. High school, 95% have completed, and close to 70% are employed. So the basic message here, which I think is included in Don and Bob's report, is that this is a population that's already been integrated. They have families, they're working, they're contributing. And of course, as you know, the Supreme Court will rule on this population later in the year, which could put them in jeopardy. So there should be some urgency and certainly targeting that population for relief. Another bill which CMS has done some analysis of is the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, another bill that would reform how we recruit farm workers, foreign-born farm workers, but also provide a path to citizenship for farm workers who have been working for years in our fields. 51% have been here 15 years or more, 70% 10 years or more, 83% have household income above the poverty level. So these are workers that have been really doing the hard work of feeding us, and they need to get some relief as well. That should be reintroduced as well. As Don mentioned, the unused visas, there was 2 pieces of legislation last Congress. The Build Back Better bill had a provision to use unused visas and redistribute them. And then Congresswoman Lofgren had a bill which was in play toward the end, at least it was in the discussion, called the Jumpstart Our Legal Immigration Act, which would take 400,000 family employment-based visas and use them for those who may be waiting in line. And I forgot to mention up front, there was a registry bill as well, which had a rolling registry, also introduced by Representative Lofgren and Senator Padilla of California. So a lot of these ideas, a lot of this research has turned up in the form of bills, which could be part of the discussion. For example, if the Senate does a bipartisan bill moving forward. Let me just finish with some of the things that we would not want to see in this type of legislation. First of all, any further erosion of the asylum system is something that, and even if it's replaced by some sort of parole program, certainly puts people in danger and violates our domestic international law. So any attempts, to codify Title 42 of some sort, or return to the Remain in Mexico program certainly should be opposed. And there should be some reform package introduced to provide more funding to the asylum system, to provide case management to ensure that people are protected and have services and get legal representation. That should be the solution, not turning people back to Mexico. And I would comment on the Biden proposal is, 30,000 visas sounds good, but who will benefit from that parole program? Certainly not the people who are at the border being returned, who are poor and running for their lives. They'll probably be those who have means. And the other thing I'll close with is the Republicans are taking another page out of their playbook by starting to attack nonprofit organizations that may assist migrants, claiming that they may be breaking the law. This idea and this debate, frankly, started in 2005 when the House passed a House Republican bill, which really was the first round of immigration reform. And this should, again, be a non-starter because, and they're also going to be attacking Catholic groups and frankly, nuns that are in other religious that are helping and trying to provide, serve their mission. This is something that will be done to score some political points, but it's something I wanted to make you aware of, and something that should be taken out of any legislation, and certainly not politicized moving forward. So with those comments and sort of laying that groundwork for what we're looking at going ahead, I'll return it to Melissa.
Thank you, Kevin. So we have some time for questions and answers. Before we do that, Bob, would you like to present on any of the policy recommendations?
No, I don't think so, except just a very broad kind of statement that you know, we have more information than we've ever had. For example, 10 years ago, the only thing we knew about undocumented immigration, we had basically 52 numbers. We had the number estimates for each state and the total in the US. We had nothing else. Now we have information down to very detailed information down to very small local levels. None of the great advance in information has moved legislation at all. So that's not the problem. Lack of knowledge about the population. And I think what we've put forth in these papers is just fairly straightforward policy proposals that really should be embraced by both sides. And I just hope that very soon the impasse will be broken and we'll start to make better progress.
Thank you, Bob. So now we have about 20 minutes left of our webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to the questions from the audience. So our first question is, can you share your thoughts on ways to deploy the excellent analysis you have done over the years, both about trends and immigrant characteristics at this point when there is decreasing political interest in evidence and data analysis?
I mean, I think I can respond to that. It's true that the Democratizing Data project is about facts. It's about evidence. And it's also about values and sensible public policy ideas. So that's the whole purpose of the project. And it has been a little bit bittersweet that we haven't, for example, had legislation on flat out bitter that we don't have legislation on DREAM or on larger populations than that. And that, I think, shows that there's something wrong. There's a real kind of impasse and a real problem in the country at this point on this issue. But that doesn't mean that what we've been doing kind of with this project has been wrong. We think it's the right approach and it's the right thing to continue. I think that there is room for hopefulness, and that's an odd thing to say after 20 years after the DREAM Act hasn't passed and 30-something years since there's been a meaningful legalization bill, a large legalization bill. But where you see hope is there's lots of important work and interest in this kind of work in local communities. Communities that are viewing immigrants and their families as important members of their communities, full members of their communities, and are really doing important integration related work, basically making, public services and benefits accessible to immigrants and trying to maximize their participation in their communities and their contributions to their communities. So I think we see a lot of interest in our work from local communities, local service providers, both public and private, and nonprofit. Also, I think on a federal level, of course, there's been a lot of what we call special legal status programs, but that is things like extending TPS to new populations or expanding existing populations who are eligible for TPS, deferred and forced departure program, DACA, which has had a very rocky road, but that's been an extremely important program. And also there's, as we know from our research, that there's a large undocumented population out there that is eligible under current law for some kind of status and hasn't pursued it, either because it's too expensive or it's not understood or whatever the case may be. And that's, to me, like a huge opportunity. And we've talked about that in the context of other reports, but basically, if tomorrow Congress was to pass a legalization bill that allowed 2 million people to seek permanent residence or to get on the path to permanent residence and citizenship, there would be a huge outpouring of support for such a program. But the fact is, there is such a program, and it's nationwide screening of the undocumented and those that are eligible for something that haven't yet come forward and applied for it. So I think that that's like something important, an important possibility. I feel like yes, it's been a little bit of a bittersweet 10 years, disappointing 10 years in terms of what's happened on a federal level, but there's a lot of room for hope too. And I think that, what other option do you have but to go with the facts and go with the values and go with good policy ideas? Otherwise, you're kind of useless as a think tank.
Thank you, Don. Our next question is, can you talk about what has been the impact of the pandemic on numbers of the undocumented population?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that one. This is a really, well, I started to say important, but it's a very interesting question, because when you look at the graph of how the population has changed from, say, 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, the foreign-born population just keeps going up. And then all of a sudden in 2020, the numbers dropped by about 1.5 million in most of the surveys. And you might think, well, wow, yeah, 1 million people got out of the country because of the pandemic. Did not happen. I can't even imagine that 1 million people would pack up and leave the country to go to another country where the response might not have even been as good as here. What we see happened is that in 2020, even though the population dropped by about 1.5 million, about 1 million of that was undercount. So a lot of undocumented immigrants just didn't get counted in 2020. The other part, the other 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 that the population dropped, I believe that there were people who probably went home during the pandemic, and they more likely, from my point of view, were what we call non-immigrants. They were foreign students, and they were temporary workers. We had about 3 million in the country in 2019. So I could easily visualize a few 100,000, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 going back to their home countries, because they're all legal and they know they can come back. And in fact, the numbers in the surveys have just been on almost a straight up trend line since 2020. By 2022, the numbers are back up to about where they were. If you just drew a straight line from 2011 up through 2019 and extended it over to 2022, it would be pretty much of a straight line. So basically, I have some hope that by 2022, those students and workers and whatever will be back, and the undocumented population will go back to mostly responding to the surveys. I can't it'll take another year or two to know whether that's true or not. But that's my take on what's happened to the numbers over the last 2 or 3 years.
Thank you, Bob. Our next question is in reference to the foreign-born and population growth portion of the misconception part of the webinar. And the question is there data on how much of the movement of immigrants leaving the US is due to deportation versus due to leaving the country due to free will?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. And I probably should have mentioned that a lot, considerably more. I don't think I can quantify it. I probably could if I really tried hard, but most of the departures from the country are voluntary. And like I say, right off the top of my head, I can't quantify that, but I can tell you that the large proportion are people who decide to go home. There are deportations every year, but not nearly at the level of voluntary departure. Actually, I think we have some of that data in our 2021 report that talks about the undocumented population as of 2019. It's the report before this one. There are a couple of tables in there that actually show how many died and how many were removed by DHS and how many left voluntarily. So you can go back and look at that and get an idea on that.
Thank you, Bob. I think we have enough time for about 1 or 2 questions. And I think the next question be a good one to round off the Q&A session. And that's, what do you think is the solution for the current situation at the southern border?
Wow.
Kevin, do you want to take a shot at that? I can say what I think about it. It's not really what these 2 papers are about, but I'd be happy to. I think that basically the way I look at what's happening there is that it's a little bit of a perfect storm, and it's a little bit of a self-inflicted wound. You know, you have post-COVID, lots of crises kind of in the places where people are coming from, related to COVID, related to climate change, related to violence, related to failed states, and all of these various things. So people are moving. That's the first thing. The second is it's self-inflicted because all of the tools that you would normally have as a country, great country, to deal with those types of situations, from development programs to diplomacy to legal immigration to the asylum system to the refugee system, they were honestly, systematically degraded under the prior administration. There's no doubt about that. So it's absolutely true that that this current administration is dealing with these crises at a time when it's trying to restore some of these systems in some way. It's really inherited terrible problems, so it didn't have the tools in place. I don't want to exonerate them completely or anything, but I just want to recognize that fact, which is true. And I think the whole idea of trying to create some more legal pathways for people to come into the country is a very sound and good idea. And would that had been in place, like the CAM program, for example, Central American Minors Program, had continued. But the idea of doing that for Venezuelans, Mexicans, Cubans, Nicaraguans is a very sound, Haitians, it's a very sound idea, because people know that migrating is a terrible risk. But if they have some way, some hope that they'll be able to come legally, that's going to do a lot to change their calculation and to convince people to wait for that. Not everybody, it's not a panacea, but it's a good measure, one way to address the situation, I think. Because like enforcement only, it just shows it's never going to work. It doesn't work. It's not going to work.
I think Don articulated it well. I mean, this doesn't fit into the 24-hour news cycle that Washington likes to play in, but you have to look at why people are coming and how over the long term we can address that. And we've been saying that for years. Certainly, it's not a quick answer. It'll probably take a lot of effort, but that's the ultimate humane long-term solution, that people will have a right to remain in their homelands and raise their families in security and safety. And then certainly in the meantime, increasing the number of legal avenues is another way. And, you know, removing asylum protections, in my opinion, won't solve the problem. If anything, it would lead to more people being desperate and trying to reach the U.S. outside of, you know, points of entry, et cetera, because they can't go back to where they live because, you know, they have a gun in their face, you know, when they go back to their home, or, you know, they're in a dictatorial country where they're being individually persecuted. So we need to find a way to fix the asylum system to ensure that we honor both our domestic and international obligations.
I'll just add one thing, and this is not my area of expertise. I'm more of a statistician, but I want to second what Kevin said, that when conditions improve in foreign countries, I will tell you, undocumented immigration in this country decreases. And I'm going to give you an example. For Poland, in 2010, we had 93,000 undocumented immigrants. Now we have 45,000. And they mostly live around Chicago and New York, but so the population from Poland has dropped that much. And I got so interested in that, I just went and did the ACE researcher kind of thing. I went to Wikipedia and I found that the conditions and economic and social conditions in Poland have been really good and increasingly better for a couple decades. And so people are just going back. Obviously, that's not going to happen in Central America in the short run, and maybe not in the long run. But I agree with that is the ultimate solution, is to, especially for sending countries, the larger sending countries, we might be able to help in the development and better security. But again, not my area.
Thank you, everyone. So we have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to give the speakers an opportunity to make closing comments. So we can start with Don.
Yeah, just that I think that it's that the method of the Democratizing Data project is an important method, and I'm hoping that, you know, CMS will continue it, and I'm hoping that the community will continue to access it and increase accessing kind of what it offers, because it really does matter and makes a big difference to have the facts at your disposal. And that's what this project does, and it weds them, as I said, to really sound kind of common sense policy ideas, and also kind of underlying values that immigrants are important to the country and ought to be able to participate and contribute to the country. So it's just a shout out for the importance of this project after 10 years.
Thank you, Don. Bob, please go ahead.
Yeah, very briefly, I would just say that we have all of the information we need now to make decisions about immigration. And it's time for Congress, for both political parties, to sit down and make the best decisions in the interest of the American people. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Kevin, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with Bob. I think the immigration advocates, which I suppose many of you are, we're going to have to play some defense, I think, in this Congress, but we shouldn't lose sight of the positive legislation that's out there that a lot of our research has pointed to as being a piece of the solution, and push to include those in whatever legislation the Senate might come up with. You know, a good offense is a good defense, as they say. And it's been a long road. It's been 20 years for DREAM. It's been longer 30. I don't be discouraged. Try to keep pushing the solutions which we think will work and benefit both the country and immigrants.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We are at the end of the hour, so please go ahead and read the reports, and please contact us if you have any questions, and feel free to also submit data requests. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.